Hello everyone, my name is Jeremy, and along with Teo we'll be doing the Group 1 presentation on Asia, and specifically we'll be talking about Japan. Now, if you're watching me on this video instead of live in Zoom, it means I'm on a military mission, so I'm either flying right now or could be in a desert location that has very spotty internet. But either way, we're going to adapt and overcome, and between Teo and myself, we'll get this presentation knocked out. Now, here's how we have it broken down here. I'll be talking about the Japan's dependence on air transportation as a factor in the Japanese economy. We'll talk about some major airports and the interregional airport concerns. We'll also talk about some bilateral open skies agreements. And then I'll be talking about safety management, cyber threat countermeasures. And then we have Teo, he'll be talking about the government oversight taxation, the air traffic issues and congestion, along with the general aviation impact and environmental concerns. Now, as we talk about the dependence on air transportation as a factor in Japan's economy, keep in mind that some of these assumptions are based on forecasts that were made prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. But I would like to start here with a quote from the International Air Transportation Association CEO, Tony Tyler. Here's what he said. Japan is important to global air transport, and air transport is critical to Japan. Could this island nation have grown to be the world's third largest economy without effective air links? The answer is no. In fact, there's no clearer example of the aviation industry being a catalyst for economic growth than Japan, where it provides vital, irreplaceable links to global markets. But I believe that aviation could be an even more powerful force in Japan's economy. That last statement appears to be in reference to some of the regulatory framework that exists in Japan, which we will talk about a little bit later in the presentation. Just a brief overview on the air transportation in Japan. There's 138 international destinations served from the country on over 100 operating airlines, representing 2.4 million takeoffs and landings. The two primary flag carriers in Japan consist of Japan Airlines, sometimes called JAL, and also Al Nippon, sometimes called ANA. Now, the 5 busiest direct flights to Japan come from the following markets: Korea, China, Taiwan, the United States, and Hong Kong. So as you can see, it's mostly all Asian Pacific region except for the United States. And it's actually broken down, 93.3% of arrivals come from Asia Pacific region. Only 3.8% arrived from North America. About 2.5% arrived from Europe. Over the next 20 years, and again, this is pre-COVID projections, based on 2017 levels, IATA expects to see a 47% increase in economic impacts to Japan. That would consist of 145.8 million passengers moved, $173 billion in economic impact to the Japanese economy, and 1.7 million jobs. These are the major airports in Japan. There's a total of 98, but the most popular hubs are operated by private companies. The first one we'll talk about here is Tokyo International, sometimes called Haneda. That is the downtown Tokyo airport and the most important airport in Japan. It's known as the 4th busiest airport in the world by traffic, and if you look at all of the air traffic in Japan, upwards of 48% of the air traffic either goes to or from Haneda Airport. So some of the local considerations, since it is right there downtown, it's a fairly noise-sensitive airport. There is no curfew there, so that's of an interesting note. The idea behind the airport, at least up until 2003, was to have Haneda as more or less a domestic operation, and that's when they wanted all the international traffic, particularly the foreign carriers, to get kicked out to Narita Airport. Now, they did allow some international operations to operate into Haneda only during the Narita curfew hours, which are 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. But The daytime slots are extremely hard to come by, and we'll talk about that on the bilateral agreement side here in a minute. Because that is a huge point in contention with the rest of the worldwide airlines and also with foreign governments. However, the fourth runway was built approximately 10 years ago there in Ada, so it did allow an expansion of total slots from 300,000 to 407,000, but only 30% of those were allocated to short-haul international via the daytime slots, and all the long-haul operations were restricted to the nighttime slots, and only 30,000 of those were made available. Now, Narita Airport, that was the primary airport built to support the international foreign carriers. The only problem with Narita is it's about 45 miles east of Tokyo, so it's not very convenient for travelers who are trying to get in and out of the Tokyo area. But Narita was the 10th busiest cargo airport. It does have the nighttime curfew, as I mentioned, between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. at the demand of the local residents. And interesting point, when they were building Narita Airport, the government ended up seizing a bunch of farmers' land and made the local citizens there extremely upset. There were all kinds of protests, and fires were set to the control tower. Lots of airport infrastructure was damaged, and unfortunately resulted in deaths to protesters and also to the police. Japan tried to learn their lessons from making the farmers mad when they built Kansai International Airport over in Osaka. They figured that they would just go ahead and build that airport out in Osaka Bay on a man-made island, which was about 5 miles offshore, and they figured that way they could keep the citizens happy by not seizing their property. The only problem with Osaka is that it's built on an island that is slowly sinking into the ocean, so there's some fairly significant engineering marvels that need to take place to save that airport. Obviously, being out over the water, the noise and environmental concerns were mitigated. However, they still made the fishermen upset for messing up all the fishing routes that were otherwise in the bay. So they still had a number of protests when they built this airport, and a lot of them were the same group of people that protested building Narita Airport. So, but it did enable the Kansai region around Osaka to be able to at least compete meaningfully with the Tokyo air market. Chubu Shincher International Airport's over in the Nagoya area. It's kind of the same concept. It was built out on a man-made island in the bay. Opened in 2005, so it's one of the newer airports. There was a rapidly growing demand in the Chubu region for a 24-hour domestic and international facility, which this new airport was able to satisfy that demand. Another interesting thing about Shincher Airport is that it's also co-located with a major seaport. So it's the only in Japan airport that can handle both large quantities of air and sea freight. As we talk about Japan's bilateral air service agreements and open skies agreements, it's important to note that historically speaking, Japan is very conservative with respect to their air transport policies, and part of that is due to just a general culture of conservatism and caution towards radical policy changes. So everything was very tightly regulated and controlled. All the market entry fares, business models are tightly controlled by the Ministry of Transport based on the Civil Aeronautics Law. Other reason for this is that in the aftermath of World War II, there were treaties that were imposed on Japan that did actually favor the Western enterprise. So it was kind of understandable how Japanese would have protectionist policies in place, thinking that a lot of the policies just were not fair to them. Japan did sign the International Air Services Transit Agreement in 1944, that did allow the first and second freedom rights to contracting states. So first freedom rights are basically overflight rights, and second freedom rights are a technical stop. So they can land and then but can't unload any cargo or passengers. They did not sign the agreements for third, fourth, and fifth freedom rights, which are kind of the meat potatoes of entering another country's markets. So any third, fourth, and fifth freedom rights that were negotiated were reserved for very specific bilateral agreements between specific countries. So we did start to see a shift in the Japanese policy starting in about 1985 with a provisional agreement with the United States to relax some of these restrictions and allowing select carriers to serve each other's markets on a reciprocal basis. So about the same time, the Japanese government eliminated the monopoly that JAL had over international flying and All Nippon had over domestic flying in Japan. So I started to see some of these policies change a little bit more in the 90s. By about 2010 was when the 1953 treaty with the United States was substantially amended, allowing further expansion into each other's markets. Interestingly enough, the major catalyst for a lot of the liberalization of economic policies in Japan was a result of what Prime Minister Abe did to enact the policy to curb the protectionism and remove barriers to entry and reform of bureaucratic regulations. Sadly enough, when I was researching what Prime Minister Abe did, was the same time that he sadly lost his life this last week. As a result of some of these shift in policies, Japan now has open skies agreements with 33 other nations and regions. Now, it's hard to say specifically what they mean by a open skies agreement because each bilateral agreement is specifically negotiated between one government body and another, and not just purely based on market forces at work. But the current bilateral agreement with the United States was last amended in 2019, and the biggest contention in that expansion was access to slots at the Haneda Airport, specifically daytime slots for U.S. carriers. And as a result of that agreement, the U.S. carriers did achieve an additional 12 daytime slots on a round-trip basis. So still a little bit of work to be done in this area. I think looking forward in terms of bilateral agreements, specifically with Japan, I think they're looking more in the regional context. During the last few years, there was a agreement signed by the ASEAN nations that was almost a true open skies agreement, kind of what the European Union has. Japan was not a part of that particular agreement, but just as recently as 2020, there was a regional comprehensive economic partnership that was signed that Japan is a party to. And I think going forward, we'll see very significant amounts of economic expansion and bilateral air service agreements kind of at that regional level. And like I pointed out before, 93% of all traffic going in and out of Japan is through other Asian Pacific countries, so this will be very important to them. Now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about aviation safety management in Japan. The policy of the country is based on the ICAO Annex 19, which is an international risk management program for civil aviation. It has the following 4 components to it. First one is safety policy and objectives, then safety risk management, safety assurance, and also safety promotion. So Japan's laws and regulations closely mirror the guidelines sent out by ICAO, specifically Article 103-2 of the Civil Aeronautics Laws, and also Articles 212-2 through 212-6 of the Civil Aeronautics Regulations. Now, much like the FAA does over in the States, they put out an advisory circular to explain to the industry what is going on with this safety management system. So in this circular 4-020, they define the term safety management system as a system that manages risk concerning safety and also includes necessary organizational structures, responsibilities, policies, and procedures. So in Japan, air carriers are directed to establish these policies and procedures, and just like the ICAO guidance specifies, they are to collect and share relevant safety information and overall risk management of identifying hazards, analyzing the risk, and implementing the appropriate controls and corrective measures. I'm going to touch briefly on the subject of cybersecurity. As we learned a little bit earlier on in the course, as information technology systems become more sophisticated and more interconnected, they also become more vulnerable to cyber attacks, be they intentionally or unintentionally. Back in 2019, the International Civil Aviation Organization, the ICAO, developed a comprehensive cybersecurity strategy that they've asked all nations to adopt. This strategy was based on the following pillars: international cooperation, governance, effective legislation and regulations, cybersecurity policy, information sharing, incident management and emergency planning, capacity building, training, and cybersecurity culture. Now, as recently as 2021, an Asian media source reported about 200 Japanese aerospace companies were affected by a massive cyber attack, and also the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency. Now, the media reports blame the attack on China. However, China denies the attack. The foreign ministry spokesman said that cyber attacks are a common challenge faced by all countries, and also warned Japan sternly against falsely accusing China of these attacks. In the wake of these kind of events, Japan is working to build their resistance. In April of the same year, Japan participated in a 30-country cybersecurity exercise called Lock Shields 2021. Now, that was sponsored by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization Cyber Defense Center of Excellence. Now, going forward to combat threats to cyber vulnerabilities in aviation and also other sectors such as finance and energy distribution, the national organization in Japan responsible for developing policies, known as the National Center for Incident Readiness and Strategy for Cybersecurity. Now, their latest strategy going forward was published in September 2021, aimed at reinforcing security measures at all levels of Japanese society. Now with that, I'm going to hand it over to Teo for his portion of the briefing.